They say marriage is a sacred bond, that love conquers all, that if you try hard enough, everything can be fixed. But reality is quieter than that, and far more complicated. Some people do not stay because they are deeply in love. They stay because leaving feels heavier than suffering. Behind closed doors, behind polite smiles at family gatherings, behind anniversary photos and shared last names, there is a silent negotiation happening inside the human heart. Why do some people remain in marriages that no longer nourish them? Why does the fear of being alone sometimes feel more dangerous than being unseen? Is it loyalty, or is it survival? Hope, or habit? This is not a story about weakness. It is a story about attachment, fear, identity, and the invisible chains that form slowly, like sediment at the bottom of a river. Today, the myth of just leave will be gently unraveled, and the truth beneath the silence will be explored. Let's begin.
There is rarely a dramatic moment. No shattered glass, no screaming confession, no single event you can point to and say, that was the day everything changed. Instead, it feels like erosion, like a shoreline slowly reshaped by tides no one notices at first. You begin to sense it in the silences, not the peaceful kind, but the heavy kind, the kind that lingers at the dinner table, the kind that turns conversations into logistics, groceries, bills, schedules, the weather. When did laughter become rare? When did touch begin to feel obligatory instead of alive? When did sharing your thoughts start to feel pointless? They say relationships require effort, and that is true, but no one talks about the difference between effort and emptiness. Effort feels tiring, but meaningful. Emptiness feels like speaking into an empty well and hearing no echo. At first, you explain it away. It's just stress. It's a phase. All couples go through this. And maybe they do. But something inside you knows the difference between a temporary cloud and a sky that hasn't been blue in years. The realization does not arrive as certainty. It arrives as discomfort, a subtle tightness in your chest, a quiet thought you quickly dismiss. Is this it? And then comes comparison. You look at other couples. You scroll through filtered images of affection and vacations and anniversaries. You wonder if they feel this distance too, or if something in your marriage quietly cracked without warning. But you don't speak it, because naming it would make it real, and reality carries weight. There is also loyalty, history, shared memories layered like sediment at the bottom of a river, the early days when everything felt electric, the promises whispered in confidence, the version of each other you both once were. How do you abandon a story you spent years writing? So you stay still. You adjust. You shrink small parts of yourself. You tell yourself not to be too sensitive. You convince yourself that love is supposed to calm down eventually, that butterflies are childish, that depth is unrealistic, that maybe this quiet dullness is simply maturity. But there is a difference between peace and numbness, and deep down you feel it. The quiet realization is not loud enough to force change, but it is strong enough to unsettle sleep. It shows up at night, when the house is dark and distractions fade. It asks gentle but uncomfortable questions. When was the last time you felt truly seen? When was the last time you felt emotionally safe? When was the last time you felt like yourself? These questions do not demand answers. They wait. And in that waiting, something begins to shift. Not action, not confrontation, just awareness. The kind that flickers like a candle in a quiet room. Small, but impossible to unsee.
The story rarely begins with the marriage. It begins much earlier, long before vows were exchanged, long before rings were placed on trembling fingers. It begins in childhood. They say love feels natural, but the truth is, love often feels familiar, and familiarity does not always mean safety. If you grew up in a home where affection was unpredictable, where warmth arrived and disappeared like a passing storm, your nervous system may have learned that inconsistency is intimacy. If love was something you had to earn through achievement, obedience, silence, then staying in an unhappy marriage may not feel strange at all.
It may feel normal, because somewhere deep inside, you learned that love requires endurance, that closeness comes with discomfort, that stability is not something you expect, it is something you hope for. Children do not question the emotional climate they grow up in. They adapt to it. A child who grows up around emotional distance may learn to suppress their needs. A child who witnesses conflict may learn to tolerate tension. A child who watches one parent sacrifice themselves may internalize sacrifice as devotion. And years later, those patterns quietly resurface. You may find yourself minimizing emotional neglect because it feels familiar. You may excuse coldness because it resembles something you survived before. You may equate staying with strength because leaving was never modeled as an option. Culture deepens the roots. In many societies, marriage is not just a relationship. It is identity. It is honor. It is stability. It is proof that you are, quote, successful in love. Leaving is often framed as failure. Staying is framed as virtue. And so the internal voice that whispers, "I am unhappy," is quickly silenced by a louder one. Be grateful. Other people have it worse. At least you are not alone. But emotional deprivation does not become smaller just because someone else's pain is larger. The human heart does not measure suffering competitively. It simply feels what it feels. There is also fear woven into the roots. Fear of disappointing family, fear of financial instability, fear of being judged, fear of starting over in a world that feels increasingly uncertain. And beneath all of that, perhaps the deepest fear of all, the fear of being unchosen. Because if the marriage ends, the mind quietly wonders, was I not enough? Sometimes staying in an unhappy marriage is less about love for the partner and more about protection from an old wound, the wound of abandonment, the wound of rejection, the wound of not feeling worthy of more. And so you endure, not because you are weak, but because your nervous system learned long ago that endurance is how you survive connection. The roots are deep, invisible, intertwined with memory and identity, and until they are gently examined, the choice to stay does not feel like a choice at all. It feels like destiny.
There is a reason logic often fails in unhappy marriages, because this is not only about logic, it is about biology. They say, if you're unhappy, just leave. But the brain does not process long-term dissatisfaction the way it processes immediate danger. In fact, it often does the opposite. The human nervous system is wired for attachment. From infancy, connection equals survival. A caregiver's presence once meant food, warmth, protection. Separation meant threat. That ancient wiring does not disappear in adulthood. It simply changes shape. In romantic bonds, the brain releases oxytocin and dopamine, chemicals that reinforce closeness and familiarity. Over time, a partner becomes more than a companion. They become part of your regulation system, your calm, your routine, your baseline sense of normal. So even when the relationship becomes emotionally barren, your nervous system still associates it with safety. Familiar pain often feels less terrifying than unfamiliar freedom. This is where attachment theory quietly explains what the heart cannot. Anxious attachment may cling tighter when love feels unstable, believing that more effort will restore closeness. Avoidant attachment may stay physically but disconnect emotionally, choosing numbness over rupture. Fearful attachment may oscillate between longing and withdrawal, trapped in a push-pull cycle. None of this is weakness. It is pattern. There is also something called trauma bonding. When moments of warmth are scattered unpredictably between periods of distance or tension, the brain becomes even more attached. Intermittent affection strengthens craving. Like a gambler pulling a lever. Maybe this time will be different. And occasionally it is. A tender conversation, a shared laugh, an apology. Hope flares up like a spark in dry grass, then fades again. But the brain remembers the spark. There is another psychological force at work, the sunk cost fallacy. The more years invested, the harder it becomes to imagine walking away. The mind whispers, "You've already given so much. Don't let it be for nothing." Yet time spent enduring does not transform into fulfillment simply because it was long. Cognitive dissonance deepens the trap. When reality conflicts with belief, marriage should make me feel loved versus I do not feel loved. The mind bends reality to reduce discomfort. It's not that bad. I'm overreacting. Every couple struggles. The brain protects itself from the pain of admitting something is broken.
because admitting it would require facing uncertainty, and uncertainty activates fear. Fear of loneliness, fear of regret, fear of discovering that life outside the marriage is not magically easier. So the nervous system chooses predictability over possibility, even if predictability slowly drains the soul. This is not stupidity. It is survival wiring operating in a modern emotional landscape. The heart longs for aliveness, but the brain clings to safety. And when those two are in conflict, safety often wins.
There is a battle that no one sees. It does not happen in courtrooms or in front of friends. It happens in the quiet privacy of your own mind. One voice whispers, "You deserve more than this." Another replies, "Don't be selfish." They say marriage requires sacrifice, but where is the line between sacrifice and self-erasure? At first, the compromises feel small. You let certain comments slide, you lower expectations, you stop bringing up needs that seem to irritate or exhaust the other person. It feels mature, responsible, adult. But slowly, something shifts. You begin filtering your emotions before expressing them. You rehearse conversations in your head and then decide they are not worth having. You become easy to live with. And in becoming easier for someone else, you become harder to recognize yourself. There is guilt woven into this war. Guilt for even feeling unhappy when nothing appears terribly wrong. Guilt for imagining a different life. Guilt for wanting more depth, more tenderness, more presence. Especially if there are children involved. Then the stakes feel higher. You tell yourself staying is stability. You tell yourself they need both parents under one roof. You tell yourself that personal fulfillment is a luxury compared to responsibility. But children are perceptive. They sense emotional climates like barometers. Silence has a temperature. Tension has a smell. Still, the fear of disrupting their world can feel unbearable. And so the war continues. There is also identity entanglement. After years together, your lives are intertwined. Financially, socially, emotionally, your routines are braided, your future plans overlap. Who are you without this marriage? Where does your identity end and the relationship begin? Sometimes staying is less about love and more about losing the version of yourself that exists inside the marriage. You are someone's spouse, someone's partner, someone's constant. Leaving would require becoming undefined, and undefined feels like standing at the edge of a cliff in thick fog. There is shame too. Society celebrates endurance. It admires couples who make it work. It quietly questions those who walk away. You imagine the whispers, the questions, the subtle blame. So you tell yourself you can handle it. You minimize the ache, you numb the resentment, you postpone the truth. But the body keeps score. Chronic stress settles into muscles. Sleep becomes shallow. Irritability grows. Emotional exhaustion becomes the background noise of daily life. And still, you wake up each morning and play your role. Because walking away feels like detonating your entire world, and staying feels like slowly disappearing inside it. This is the inner war. Not dramatic, not visible, but relentless. Hope can be beautiful. It can also be binding. They say hope keeps love alive, but sometimes hope keeps pain alive too. In unhappy marriages, hope rarely looks dramatic. It does not shout, it whispers. Maybe this is just a hard season. Maybe when work stress decreases. Maybe when the children grow older. Maybe next year will feel different. The mind creates a future where everything softens, and that imagined future becomes easier to hold than the present reality. There is a psychological phenomenon called intermittent reinforcement. When something good happens unpredictably, just often enough to prevent complete despair, the attachment strengthens. A random compliment, an affectionate evening, a meaningful conversation after weeks of distance. These moments glow like embers in a dark room, and suddenly you remember why you fell in love. You remember the early days, the electricity, the shared dreams, the laughter that once felt effortless. Nostalgia begins to paint over present dissatisfaction. You do not compare today to what you need. You compare today to what it used to be. And that comparison keeps hope alive. Habit deepens the bond even further. Human beings are creatures of routine.
Shared mornings, familiar arguments, predictable silence, these become rhythms. And rhythms feel stabilizing, even when they are hollow. Leaving would mean disrupting every ritual, every holiday, every weekend pattern, every inside joke. The brain resists disruption. There is comfort in knowing how the day will unfold, even if it unfolds without joy. Hope and habit intertwine like vines. One says, tomorrow might improve. The other says, at least today is familiar. And so time stretches. Months become years. You wait for the relationship to return to what it once was. But relationships do not rewind like old films. They evolve, or they erode. Still, the illusion of tomorrow feels safer than the clarity of today, because acknowledging that this is not enough carries a heavy implication. It suggests that change may be required, and change is unpredictable. Hope allows you to postpone that reckoning. It softens the sharp edges of dissatisfaction. It gives suffering a narrative arc. This will make sense someday. But sometimes hope is not a bridge to healing. Sometimes it is a cushion that makes staying tolerable. And the question lingers quietly beneath it all. Are you staying because you believe things will change? Or because imagining life without this hope feels unbearable? Hope can sustain love, but it can also sustain illusion. And the heart, tired and loyal, often chooses the illusion of tomorrow over the discomfort of today.
There is a cost to everything, even to silence. They say staying is strength, that endurance is noble, that commitment means pushing through discomfort. But what happens when discomfort becomes your permanent climate? At first, the cost is subtle. You stop sharing certain thoughts because they are not received well. You stop expressing certain emotions because they complicate the atmosphere. You stop asking for certain needs because the answer has already disappointed you too many times. And slowly, you become smaller. Not visibly, but internally. Your laughter becomes quieter. Your opinions become filtered. Your dreams become postponed. You tell yourself this is maturity, that real love is steady, not electric, that intensity is unrealistic. But there is a difference between calm waters and stagnant ones. When emotional needs go unmet for long periods, the body responds. Chronic stress becomes normalized. Sleep grows lighter. Irritation simmers just beneath the surface. You may not even label it unhappiness anymore. It becomes baseline. There's also the quiet emergence of resentment. Not explosive anger, but sediment. Fine particles settling at the bottom of the relationship. Every dismissed feeling. Every forgotten anniversary of effort. Every time you felt alone beside someone. Resentment does not always shout. Sometimes it hardens. It shows up as sarcasm, as emotional withdrawal, as indifference. And indifference can be more dangerous than conflict, because conflict still implies care. Indifference implies depletion. Over time, identity erosion begins. You once had hobbies that lit you up, curiosities, spontaneous ideas. Now, energy is rationed. You prioritize harmony over authenticity, peace over truth, and the cost becomes existential. Who are you becoming in this environment? What parts of yourself are you slowly burying? The human spirit is resilient, but it is not immune to long-term emotional deprivation. When aliveness is suppressed for too long, numbness takes its place. Numbness feels safer than constant disappointment. But numbness is not fulfillment. There is also the invisible cost of modeling. If others are watching, children, family, friends, they absorb relational dynamics silently. They learn what love looks like by observing it. And sometimes what they see is coexistence without connection. Staying can preserve structure, but structure without emotional presence can feel hollow. This is not to condemn staying. It is to acknowledge its weight, because every choice carries consequence. And sometimes the greatest cost of staying in an unhappy marriage is not dramatic collapse. It is the gradual fading of the self. Quiet, unnoticed, but deeply felt. There comes a moment, quiet, almost fragile, when something inside you stops arguing and starts listening. Not to your partner, not to society, not to fear, but to yourself. They say clarity arrives like lightning, but often it arrives like a whisper. After months, sometimes years of inner war, exhaustion softens resistance. You may not have made any decisions yet. Nothing external has changed,
The marriage still looks the same from the outside, but internally, something shifts. You begin noticing your own reactions without immediately dismissing them. You begin acknowledging your disappointment without labeling it ungratefulness. You begin allowing the thought, I matter too, to exist without shame. This is not rebellion, it is recognition. For a long time, your focus may have been outward, managing harmony, preventing conflict, sustaining stability. Your emotional energy flowed toward preserving the structure. Now, attention gently turns inward. What do you feel when no one is watching? What do you long for when you are honest? What have you silenced so thoroughly that you barely remember it had a voice? Reclaiming the inner voice is not about sudden courage. It is about tolerating truth. Truth that may be inconvenient. Truth that may not fit the narrative you built. Truth that may disrupt comfort. And yet it feels relieving, because denial is heavy. When you stop fighting your own perception, there is a subtle release in the body. The tension in your chest loosens. Your thoughts become clearer. Sleep may still be complicated, but your mind feels less divided. You begin separating your identity from the marriage. You remember preferences that have nothing to do with compromise. You revisit interests that once felt alive. You notice how your energy changes when you are alone versus when you are in relational tension. This awareness does not force action. It simply restores perspective. And perspective is powerful. For some, this is the beginning of difficult conversations. For others, it is the beginning of boundaries. For many, it is simply the beginning of honesty with themselves. You may still feel fear. You may still feel loyalty. You may still feel hope. But alongside those feelings, there is now something else. Self-respect. Not loud, not aggressive, just present. Reclaiming the inner voice means recognizing that your emotional landscape matters, even if you choose to stay, even if you choose to leave. The decision is secondary. The awareness is primary, because once you truly hear yourself, you can no longer pretend you are invisible to your own heart.
There is no simple ending to a story like this. No universal answer. No clean formula. They say strong people stay. Others say strong people leave. But strength is not measured by the direction you choose. It is measured by the honesty behind it. Staying in an unhappy marriage does not automatically mean weakness. Leaving does not automatically mean courage. Both can be acts of fear. Both can be acts of clarity. Human relationships are complex ecosystems. They carry history, attachment, shared pain, shared growth, shared responsibility. A marriage is not just two individuals. It is memory, identity, ritual, and sometimes survival. That is why the choice is rarely obvious. For some, staying becomes a conscious decision, not out of denial, but out of values, context, or commitment to rebuild. For others, leaving becomes the only way to protect what remains of the self. There is no moral hierarchy between these paths, only personal truth. And personal truth is quiet. It does not shout over society's expectations. It does not compete with family opinions. It does not rush you. It waits. The most important shift is not the decision itself. It is the return to agency. When staying feels like obligation, resentment grows. When staying becomes a chosen act, even with difficulty, dignity returns. When leaving feels like escape, fear dominates. When leaving becomes an aligned choice, grief and relief can coexist. Choice restores power. And power, gentle, grounded power, restores self-trust. Perhaps the deepest truth is this. You are allowed to acknowledge your unhappiness without shaming yourself for it. You are allowed to feel conflicted without labeling yourself broken. You are allowed to take time. There is no expiration date on clarity, and there is no single script for love. The psychology of staying is not about weakness. It is about attachment, conditioning, fear, hope, identity, and the very human desire to belong. When you understand that, compassion replaces judgment for others and for yourself. If this video made you feel seen, if parts of this reflection felt uncomfortably familiar, if something quiet inside you is touched, something you rarely let surface, know that you are not alone in that complexity. Many people live in the gray spaces of love, in the in-between,
in the silent negotiations that no one else can see. Your feelings do not make you dramatic. Your confusion does not make you weak. Your hesitation does not make you incapable. It makes you human. If you would like to stay connected, this channel is a space where the hidden corners of the human heart are explored gently, without judgment, without pressure, without simple answers. And if you feel comfortable, you're welcome to share your thoughts below, not because you must, but because sometimes your honesty might help someone else realize they are not alone in theirs. Take what resonated, leave what did not. Take care of yourself. You deserve gentleness.